The moon hung low over the small, forgotten town of Ashbrook, its pale light spilling over crooked rooftops and empty streets. At the heart of the town, surrounded by a rusting iron fence tangled with thorny vines, lay St. Hallow's Cemetery, a desolate, sprawling necropolis shrouded in mystery. Few dared to enter after dark. Those who did rarely spoke of what they saw, and the few who did never quite made sense. The whispers began centuries ago, when St. Hallow's became more than just a resting place for the dead. The townsfolk swore they saw shadows moving between the mausoleums, heard faint cries drifting on the wind, and, worse, found freshly dug graves that no one claimed responsibility for. No one buried the bodies. No one even knew who they were. As the story goes, the cemetery's grim reputation solidified one October night many years ago. A group of daring teenagers, full of bravado and cheap whiskey, decided to spend the night among the graves. They brought flashlights, sleeping bags, and snacks, laughing off the town's warnings. By dawn, only one of them stumbled out through the gate. His clothes were shredded, his skin pale as bone, and his mind fractured. All he could mutter, over and over, was, "They are waiting for you." He disappeared 2 weeks later, leaving behind only his bloody handprints smeared across his bedroom walls. Now, in the present day, St. Hallow's Cemetery has become a twisted curiosity for thrill-seekers and amateur ghost hunters. Among them is James Holloway, a documentary filmmaker known for uncovering urban legends. He arrives in Ashbrook with his small team, determined to unravel the enigma surrounding the cursed graveyard. But from the moment they step into the town, something feels off. The air is heavy, damp, with a faint metallic tang that clings to the tongue. The locals avoid eye contact when asked about the cemetery, their faces pale with unease. The only person willing to talk is an elderly woman named Martha, who lives on the edge of town in a crumbling Victorian house. "They won't rest," she says, her voice a brittle whisper as she peers at James through a crack in her door. Her eyes glisten with fear. Not until they've found what they're looking for. James presses her for details, but she slams the door, leaving him with only her cryptic warning. Undeterred, he and his crew press on, setting up camp just beyond the cemetery gates. As night falls, the atmosphere grows oppressively silent. Even the wind seems to avoid the cemetery, leaving the dead leaves eerily still. James captures everything on camera: the mausoleums, the cracked headstones, and the chilling inscriptions etched into the granite. Here lies the forgotten. At midnight, the crew hears it for the first time, a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across stone. It comes from the direction of the oldest part of the cemetery, where the graves are so weathered their names have long since eroded. They follow the noise, their flashlights slicing through the suffocating darkness. The sound grows louder, closer. When they reach the source, they find an open grave. Freshly dug, the soil is piled neatly beside it, the edges of the hole unnervingly clean, as though carved by something sharper than a spade. At the bottom of the grave lies an ornate coffin, its lid slightly ajar. James hesitates but eventually climbs down, his curiosity outweighing his fear. He pushes the lid open, revealing a withered corpse clutching something tightly to its chest, a small, leather-bound book. Its cover is scorched, and its pages pulse faintly with a sickly green light, as though alive. As James reaches for the book, a bone-chilling scream pierces the air. It doesn't come from the graveyard. It comes from within the coffin. The corpse's eyes snap open, hollow sockets filled with swirling darkness. Its mouth stretches impossibly wide, releasing another guttural wail that sends James tumbling backward into the dirt. The coffin begins to shake violently, and the earth around the grave shudders as if trying to swallow them all whole. And then it begins. The other graves start to stir. The ground cracks, splinters of wood and skeletal hands emerging from the soil. The mausoleums groan as their stone doors slide open, revealing shadowy figures shrouded in the stench of decay. They move unnaturally, their heads twisting at impossible angles as they step into the moonlight. James and his crew scramble to flee, but the gates of the cemetery slam shut with a deafening clang, trapping them inside. They are no longer outsiders documenting a legend. They are part of the story now. The gate's iron bars loomed overhead, their jagged tops dripping with rust as if they had bled for centuries. No amount of pulling, pushing, or ramming could budge them. James Holloway wiped his trembling hands on his jeans, his mind spinning with panic. Around him, his team mirrored his fear. Sarah, their sound engineer, stood frozen, her microphone forgotten on the ground. Marco, the cameraman, gripped his gear like a lifeline, the red light of the camera blinking furiously. Behind them, the graveyard came alive in a symphony of horror. Shadows moved where there should have been none. Shapes crawled, twisted, and slithered between tombstones, their motions disjointed, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. The air carried a low, resonating hum, vibrating in their bones. It wasn't just the dead rising, it was the cemetery itself awakening. "James," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. What do we do?" Before he could answer, the first figure emerged fully from the earth. It wasn't a skeleton, nor was it a corpse. It was something else. Its form was thin, impossibly elongated, its skin stretched taut like wax melted over jagged bones. Its hollow sockets locked onto Sarah, and it began to lurch forward, dragging its body with long, gnarled fingers that raked the ground. James grabbed Sarah's arm, yanking her back just as Marco swung his camera toward the creature. "Keep filming," James barked, his voice cracking. "Whatever happens, we need proof." The creature halted at the edge of the flashlight's beam, hissing and retreating into the shadows. But it didn't leave. Its head twisted unnaturally to follow them, its movements jerking like a glitch in reality. "They don't like the light," Marco muttered, his voice barely audible. Taking the hint, the group fanned out their flashlights, creating a barrier of beams. The creatures writhed at the edges, unable to advance but multiplying by the second. From every grave, from every mausoleum, they came, clawed hands, skeletal faces, and worse. Some bore remnants of their former lives, tattered funeral attire, jewelry gleaming dully in the moonlight, or the decayed remains of wedding veils. But others defied explanation. Fleshless beasts, crawling on too many limbs, their mouths filled with rows of jagged teeth that didn't belong in this world. The group retreated, the flashlight barrier their only salvation. But they knew they couldn't hold out forever. Their batteries wouldn't last the night. "Back to the grave," James said suddenly, his voice urgent. "What?" Marco snapped. "Are you insane?" "The book," James explained, pointing to the open grave they had fled moments before. "It's the only thing that changed when this started. It's got to be connected." Reluctantly, they made their way back, the ground beneath them soft and unstable. The coffin still sat in the pit, its lid ajar. The corpse inside hadn't moved. Its hollow eyes stared into nothingness, but its grip on the book remained firm. James slid into the grave without waiting for the others. The stench of decay hit him like a wall, making him gag. His flashlight flickered as he reached for the book, his hand trembling. The moment his fingers brushed the cover, an ear-splitting shriek tore through the air. The corpse's jaw dropped open, wider and wider, until its face was little more than a void. From that void came a swarm of blackened flies, pouring out in a thick, buzzing cloud that engulfed him. He screamed, swatting at them, but they seemed to bite into his skin, their tiny teeth burning like fire. "Pull him out," Sarah shouted, grabbing James by the arm and yanking him free. But the book came with him, its cover burned cold in his hands, as if frostbite was spreading through his veins. He tried to drop it, but his fingers wouldn't release it. The leather-bound tome pulsed faintly, emitting an eerie, otherworldly hum. "What now?" Marco asked, backing away as another wave of creatures began clawing their way toward them. James could only shake his head, his mind racing. "We read it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The group huddled together, their flashlights forming a fragile circle of light. James opened the book, its pages cracked and brittle, filled with spidery handwriting in a language none of them recognized. Symbols swirled on the page, almost moving, drawing the eye deeper into their patterns. As James scanned the pages, the cemetery began to tremble. The hum grew louder, turning into an almost deafening drone. From the ground, thick tendrils of black mist slithered upward, weaving toward the group like sentient smoke. "James!" Sarah shouted, shaking his shoulder. "Do something." His eyes locked onto a single word written repeatedly on one page. A name. Arthur. "I think it's a summoning," James said, his voice trembling. "You think?" Marco shouted, his flashlight swinging wildly as one of the creatures lunged, recoiling just before its claws reached his arm. James didn't respond. He began to read aloud, his tongue tripping over the alien syllables. Each word felt heavy, resonating through the cemetery. The creatures shrieked in unison, their bodies convulsing violently. The ground cracked open, a jagged, yawning fissure splitting the earth beneath the group. From the chasm rose a soundless void, an absence of light, sound, and life itself. It twisted and churned like liquid shadow, its form barely contained within the rift. Azathoth had been awakened. The creatures recoiled from the entity, their grotesque forms prostrating themselves in its presence. James froze, unable to look away from the seething mass of darkness. It wasn't just black, it was anti-light, something so wrong that his mind struggled to comprehend its existence. From within the void came a voice. It didn't speak in words but in emotions. Fear, despair, and an overwhelming hunger. It wanted more than the dead. It wanted them. The book in James's hands grew unbearably cold, and he felt his grip loosening. If he dropped it, he knew it would all be over. But how could he fight something that shouldn't even exist? James stood paralyzed as the void loomed before him. Azathoth's presence was suffocating, a formless mass of despair that sapped the will to fight. Around him, Sarah and Marco clung to each other, their faces pale and hollow, as though the entity had already begun draining their essence. The book pulsed violently in James's hands, as though reacting to the creature's hunger. His grip tightened, ignoring the freezing pain that crept up his arms. Somehow, the book felt alive, an extension of Arthur itself, tied to its existence. "James, what do we do?" Sarah's voice cut through the haze of dread, desperate and raw. He didn't answer immediately, his mind racing. Then it clicked. The book brought it here. Maybe it can send it back. With trembling hands, James flipped the pages frantically, searching for anything resembling a banishment or seal. The symbols seemed to shift under his gaze, mocking him, but a single page glowed faintly, a series of sigils surrounded by text. The same alien script stared back at him, but now it felt different. He couldn't explain how, but the meaning bled into his mind. "It's a binding spell," he muttered, half to himself. "We can trap it again." "Then do it," Marco yelled, swinging his flashlight toward another of the creatures inching closer. His voice cracked as he shouted, "We are running out of time." James began to chant, stumbling over the guttural, inhuman syllables. Each word felt like it took a piece of his soul, leaving him more drained, more vulnerable. The ground beneath them quaked violently, and Azathoth's void-like form began to shift, its chaotic tendrils reaching outward, testing the boundaries of the cemetery. The creatures screamed, their forms dissolving into ash as the entity drew their essence back into itself. It was feeding, growing stronger. The chant reached a crescendo, and the sigil on the page began to burn into the air around James, floating like embers. The fissure that Azathoth had risen from began to shudder, its edges glowing with a sickly green light. The pull of the spell was working, but not fast enough. Suddenly, Azathoth's formless mass surged forward. A tendril of pure darkness lashed out, striking Marco in the chest. He didn't even scream. His body crumpled like a marionette with its strings cut, his camera clattering to the ground. "Marco!" Sarah screamed, lunging toward him, but James grabbed her arm. "We can't help him," he said through gritted teeth, his voice cracking. "We have to finish this." The void turned its focus to James, as if realizing he was the source of its containment. Tendrils whipped toward him, but the glowing sigil surrounding him seemed to hold them back, forming a fragile barrier. The book burned brighter, its pages turning on their own as if possessed. James felt his strength ebbing away with every word he spoke, his body trembling from the strain. Sarah knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder for support, her flashlight still casting away the encroaching creatures. Come on, James muttered, forcing the final incantation from his lips. The sigil erupted in a blinding light, and the air was filled with an ear-splitting roar, Arthur's voice, a cacophony of rage and despair. The fissure beneath it widened, its pull growing stronger as the spell dragged the entity back toward the abyss. Azathoth resisted, its tendrils lashing out wildly. One struck Sarah, sending her sprawling to the ground. She screamed in pain, clutching her leg as blood seeped through her jeans. James faltered, his focus breaking for a moment, and the sigil dimmed. "James," Sarah cried out, "you have to finish it." Gritting his teeth, James forced himself to his feet. His vision blurred, his limbs heavy, but he knew there was no other choice. With one final effort, he screamed the last words of the incantation. The book exploded in a burst of searing light, the force throwing James and Sarah backward. The sigil formed a glowing cage around Arthur, shrinking, constricting, forcing the void back into the fissure. The ground trembled violently, cracks racing outward as the entity was sealed once more. With a final, deafening roar, Azathoth was gone. The fissure closed with a thunderous boom, and the cemetery fell silent. James and Sarah lay on the ground, gasping for breath. Around them, the creatures had disintegrated into ash, leaving only the eerie stillness of the graveyard. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, but the scars of the night remained. Marco's lifeless body lay crumpled near the gate, his face frozen in an expression of terror. James crawled toward him, his heart heavy with guilt. We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "But at what cost?" James didn't respond. He stared at Marco's body, his hands trembling. The cemetery may have been quiet now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The book was gone, reduced to ashes, but Azathoth's presence still lingered in the back of his mind, a shadow that refused to leave. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, James and Sarah stumbled out of the cemetery, leaving behind the horrors of St. Hallows. But even as they reached the safety of the town, James knew one thing for certain. The dead might rest, but ** never would.